Since 1999, it's been our tradition to have the 5th lecture in the Law and Literature Weekend to be given by Marc Connor. And it is an honor for me to introduce him to you. Most of you know him quite well. Those of you who don't, he's the Ballengee Professor of English at W&L. He's the Interim Provost of the university, the author of numerous books. He shaped the spring term, which is one of the core programs of the university. He very frequently takes students to Ireland and other places for special courses. He's a lecturer in the Great Courses program. I urge you all to look into that. He's got 2 sets of those lectures that are very much worth listening to and repeatedly. He's known on campus as really the embodiment of the teacher-scholar. But there's another thing. As provost, he is the chief academic officer. That's what we think of as the provost here. So what does that really mean? He's the leader of the faculty. He's the person who really is in the trenches with us, trying to help us to thrive in our teaching, our scholarship, whatever we do at the university. And I can attest that he is fantastic at that job. He really is concerned about keeping W&L at the very top in terms of faculty talent, faculty ability to do our jobs. And he has taken a personal interest in us well before he became provost, but particularly now. So it's great that you're giving the 5th lecture again this year, and I give you Marc Connor.
Well, Brian, thank you so much for that great introduction, and especially for saying a few words about, if you want to kill conversation in a room, say, hey, what does the provost do? Nobody has any clue. That was a wonderful summation of a provost job. In Shakespeare's day, the provost was also the keeper of a prison. And there are some days on the job when that has a remarkably apt ring to it for somebody. But of course, it's been great fun. And in particular, being Chief Academic Officer, being able to come over to the law school and work so closely with Brian and Brant and Bob and so many wonderful faculty and students over here has really been a delight. I cannot believe I've done the Law and Lit lecture for 17 years in a row now. We were saying last night, for many of you, this is sort of your annual autumn pilgrimage, and it's become that for me as well, and always look forward to it. And it's such a delight to be talking about another great book. And it's a great delight to go last, because the lectures that come before were so rich and so fascinating. And they give me so much to build upon. Brian's fantastic posing of the great questions of this play. And when you teach Shakespeare, you start with the questions, because the questions are what drives these plays. And then Dave's fascinating lecture. Dave has this sort of self-deprecating, hey, it's me and my banjo sort of thing. And then, of course, what he is doing is addressing the place where literature and ethics come together, where literature tells us something about what we ought to do and be in the world. And there's no better question to ask about a great work of literature, and he does it so well. And then Bob Danforth, I'm going to be drawing upon his remarks today. I thought nothing could be further from what I'm going to say than estate planning. But of course, he was exactly right in some of the things he said about Lear, and in particular what he said about Edmund. I'm so glad we got to Edmund. And then I thought Matt's performance last night and his lecture today were superb. And I approach Shakespeare, I am a teacher of Shakespeare who emphasizes Shakespeare in performance as well as Shakespeare as a poet. So I pride myself on really taking the view of performance and stagecraft and the tools of stagecraft, but I am not myself a theater person. And when I get to hear somebody like Matt, who is so immersed in the roles and knows them inside and out and knows what it means to inhabit a role in performance, the insights that he generates are just magnificent. So Really do feel like I'm drawing on a lot of great comments that came before me. The title of my talk, I'm going to talk about folly, madness, nothing, and homelessness. And as we've heard from the previous talks, those words are everywhere in this play, which sort of means I get to talk about everything in this play, which seems like a bit of a luxury. I want to jump in with this first idea of nothing will come of nothing. And Matt talked very well about the nihilistic reading of Lear, and I want to puzzle a bit with this word nothing. This starts in the first scene of the first act, and I'm going to be reading a number of passages from the play, rooting a lot of my comments in specific language. And we heard this scene last night when Lear asks of Cordelia, "What can you say?" It's a command to her speech. What can you say to draw a third more opulent than your sisters? Speak. And there's this demand for words, and her response is, "Nothing, my lord." Nothing as a question, nothing as a statement. How? Nothing will come of nothing. Speak again. And there's this demand that language accomplish something in this play. In this case, he wants language to accomplish an attestation of love, of fidelity, I think of idolatry. And instead she offers nothing, or the nothing. And this gets returned to over and over again. There's a great moment, a little bit further on, when Kent, Lear, and the fool are all speaking. And the fool gives one of his little poems, and Kent says, "This is nothing, fool." And notice the way Shakespeare is putting these words together, nothing, fool, or folly. He begins to stick these words together to help us see the associations. The fool says, in one of many fine lawyer jokes in Shakespeare, "Then 'tis like the breath of an unfeed lawyer, you gave me nothing for it. Can you make no use of nothing, nuncle?" And even there, uncle, nuncle, is a kind of negation of that title. "Why no, boy, nothing can be made out of nothing. Prithee tell him, so much the rent of his land comes to, he will not believe a fool." Nothing can be made out of nothing. We think of nothing as the evacuation of all things. But there's another reading of nothing, that it is a kind of liberation. It frees one from the clutter of somethings, of objects. This is the way the great existentialist philosophers in the early 20th century, like Martin Heidegger, talk about being and nothing. So the nothing becomes itself a noun, but it's the opposite of all of the somethings that are the very things Lear thinks he wants. When he wants Cordelia to speak, he wants her to give him a something. Words of idolatry, words of love, words of her fidelity. Instead, she gives him an alternative thing, the nothing. And he is challenged to make something out of that nothing. And we can understand Lear's progress in this play, if progress it is, as an effort to make something out of nothing, or to understand the nothing as something positive, something generative. And it's so interesting that it begins with words. What words can you offer? He asks Cordelia, and she gives him nothing. This is a play, how to put this? This play doesn't need any more words than it has. This is a play that is not only filled with words, it's a very long play, but it also is about the excess of language. What do Regan and Goneril give to Lear at the start of the play? Way too many words if all they need to say is, "I love you." And there's a number of complications at work there. First, that simply saying "I love you" is not enough. They need to fill that with this plethora of language. In a way, they give lots of somethings, lots of words, but it equates to nothing. There's no meaning there in what they say. And Lear himself talks too much. He's trying to fill the void with his language, as if an excess of words can replace the emptiness or vacuum of meaning with which he is faced. And when we look at Lear on the heath in the spectacular Act 3, Scene 2, and we'll see a clip of that in a moment, you'll get a sense of what I mean, trying to match words to this nothingness. And of course, Cordelia says, when she says to herself in that wonderful aside, "What shall Cordelia say?" Her answer is, love and be silent. It's a marvelous compression of language. Love and be silent. So for her, love is not an empty word, it is a deed. It is a verb, it is an action. And it's the brevity of her expression that ought to make us think even early on, this is a different expression. This is different from what Regan and Goneril are giving. And when she says to him, nothing, my lord, how does she mean this, and how does Lear take this? This is a question that runs throughout the play. And there's a wonderful assignment that English scholars give when they're assigning a paper to students saying, take this one word and trace it throughout the work. So like the word fire in Jane Eyre, for example, is a marvelous one for that. Nothing in King Lear. If you're really reading for that word, you'll be amazed how frequently it recurs and in what startling contexts. The nothing is something to be confronted in this play. That is one thing that this play is all about. And I thought Matt made a great point that reading Lear as merely the victim of a known disease is not equal to the metaphysical reach of this play. It goes literally metaphysical, it goes beyond the physical. And that's the realm of the nothing. Let's take a look at scene 4 in the first act. Scene 4, line 126. This is right where I left off a moment ago when Lear says to the fool, nothing can be made out of nothing. And the fool then says, dost thou know the difference, my boy, between a bitter fool and a sweet one? No, lad, teach me, says Lear. And of course we get one of these great dynamics of the play where the fool is the figure of wisdom, the fool is the one teaching the king. He says, that Lord that counseled thee to give away thy land, come place him here by me, do thou for him stand. The sweet and bitter fool will presently appear, the one in motley here, the other found out there. And he points to Lear. Dost thou call me fool, boy? All thy other titles thou hast given away, that thou wast born with. And then Kent, we've had a lot of good attention to Kent, very interesting figure. This is not altogether fool, my lord. He understands that quite well. The fool in the role of teacher, that is making something out of nothing. The fool is the most disempowered person in this society, and yet in many ways he is a figure of great influence over Lear, or the effort at that influence. He's sort of knocking at the sides of Lear's head, trying to get some wisdom in there that Lear does not hear. And he's teaching him about the uses of nothing. And he says of Lear's folly, you were born a fool. That title you had at the start. Now that's a very radical thing to say during the reign of King James, who talked about the divine right of kings. The fool is suggesting you weren't born king, God didn't make you king in this essential way. The one essential thing you are, what the human thing comes down to, again a great question of this play, you're a fool. That's the title you were born with. That's the title we all share. That's another version of the nothing. Another example of this, we don't have to turn to this, but I'll just grab it real quick. I'm going to say more about this in a minute, but when Kent confronts Oswald, the slimiest of slimy servants in Shakespeare's plays, he calls him, thou whoreson Z, the last letter, thou unnecessary letter. There's a great t-shirt at the Blackfriars, great Shakespearean insults, and thou unnecessary letter. That's a great one. Great. It's like, we don't even need you. But more than that, you do not contribute to the language. You're a letter that we don't need. We ought not to even speak what you are. You shouldn't even play a role in language itself. Put differently, language and nothingness are conjoined in this play over and over again. Remember the excess of language with which it begins. Regan's excess of language, Goneril's excess of language, Cordelia's magnificent brevity of language. The play suggests that our language needs to be simplified, that we need to say what we mean and no more than that. Now, if you're following along on my outline, I'm going to skip from 3 to 2 and then go back to 3. Though if you've been coming to these lectures for the last several years, you know it's folly to try to follow my outlines as if I'm going to be close to that. But I want to go to this point of the humbling of Lear. And this is especially prominent in Acts 3 and 4. But Kent talks to a knight at the very opening of Act 3. He says, "Where's the king?" And the knight says he's out there in the storm. He strives in his little world of man to outscorn the to and fro conflicting wind and rain. Strives in his little world of man. So Lear takes the world of man and he is pitching it against this world of nature. And I'm going to give you one quick scene of this. This is from the Edgar Sharon directed version, where James Earl Jones plays a magnificent Lear. And the volume on this system doesn't go particularly high. So, I don't know, listen really well or something. It's not going to be super loud, but it should be loud enough. This is just Lear on the Storm, Act 3, Scene 2.
Blow winds and cut your teeth. Rage, blow, you cataracts and hurricanes, spout till you have drenched our steeples drown the gods. Your sulphurous and thought-executing fires for couriers of all gleaming thunderbolts singe my white head, and thou, all shaking thunder, crack the thick fraternity of the world. Crack nature walls, all germane, spirit ones that make ingrateful man. Thunder! Could only water in dry house is better than rainwater on guard. The knuckle in, ask for her blessing. Here's a night that he's neither wise man nor fool. Rumble, thy belly full. Spitfire, spout rain. Blow rain, wind, thunder, fire, my daughters. I tempt you not, you elements with unkindness. I never gave you kingdom, called you children. You owe me no subscription. Then let fall your horrible pleasure. Here I stand, your slave, a poor, infirm, weak, and despised old man. But yet I call you servile ministers that will, with two pernicious daughters, join your high-engendered battles against a head so old and white as this. Oh, this foul! He that has a house to put his head in has a good headpiece. The dark piece that will house, before the head has any, the head and he will allow. So beggars merrymaning, the man that makes his toe what he his heart should make, will have a corn cry woe and turn his sleep to wake. But I was never yet fair woman, but she made mouths in a glass. I will be the pattern of all patience. I will say nothing. Who's there? Hey! His grace in a cut piece! Let the one...
I was going to let it play a little bit more because it's so magnificent, but time's ticking, so I'll move along. That really is probably the iconic scene in Lear. This figure of the king on the heath, sending forth his language to contest with the elements themselves. And it's one of the great challenges of playing this role, how to have a rage that is equal to what the heavens are doing. Also a real challenge technically. Do you reproduce the sounds of the storm? Or do you simply let Lear cry out and imagine the sounds of the storm coming back? But it's this opposition of the little world of man, exemplified in our words, our excess of words, against nature itself and the power of nature. Now, the very next thing that happens as we go on further in this scene and further in Act 3 is the appearance then of Edgar as poor Tom. And Lear has this great moment when the storm gets at its worst. And he says, "Is man no more than this? Consider him well. Thou owest the worm no silk, the beast no hide, the sheep no wool, the cat no perfume. Ha! Here's three of us are sophisticated. Thou art the thing itself. Unaccommodated man is no more but such a poor, bare, forked animal as thou art. Off, off, you lendings, come, unbutton here. And he begins to tear off his clothing. And this, as I indicated a few moments ago, this is the great question of the play. Is man no more than this? Is man no more than a nothing in the face of an indifferent creation? And then the fool comes out of the hovel and says there's a madman in the hovel. And now poor Tom comes out. So you have the king, the fool, and the madman all on stage together in the midst of this storm. It is an astonishing tableau. You know, a tableau is a sort of fixed moment on the stage that carries great meaning. And we get this tableau on the stage here. And that line, thou art the thing itself. One great scholar, Northrop Frye, has called that a miracle of condensed verbal power. Thou art the thing itself. Notice the language, monosyllabic, thou art the thing itself. Condensed verbal power. It's like Cordelia's love and be silent. These moments of condensed speech seem to be the times when truth or something of great meaning emerges. We then move into Act 4. In Act 4, Scene 6, this is the last moment when Lear is still fleeing. They're trying to bring him in. And he says, when the rain came to wet me once, and the wind to make me chatter, when the thunder would not peace at my bidding. And it's interesting, he seems to have thought his power as king would really give him control over the weather itself, control over the cosmos. There I found 'em, there I smelt 'em out. Go to, they are not men of their words. They told me I was everything. 'Tis a lie. I am not ague-proof. I'm not proof against illness, against sickness. He's learning his limitations. This is the humbling of Lear, as I talked about before. And Gloucester, blinded, says, the trick of that voice I do well remember, is it not the king? And Lear responds, aye, every inch a king. Rich now with irony, a sense that he has learned some of the wisdom of the fool. I am not a king, I am nothing. Or at best, I am a fool, which is like the nothing. We'll come back to that in a moment because it's really good. Yes, so the play in the figure of Lear, the humbling of Lear, from Act 1, where he thinks he is everything, to Act 4, where he realizes he is nothing, it shows the radical emptying out of his sense of self. He goes from the highest to the lowest, from everything, which is all the somethings in the world, to nothing. And I would submit that this is not the tragic direction of the play. If there is a salvific pilgrimage for Lear, it is going from everything to nothing. Only when he embraces the nothing can he begin to be saved. All right, I want to switch now, back to point 2 in my outline, and talk a bit about bastards. And Bob did me a great favor by opening up this idea of the bastard. In my outline, I title it Bastards, the Negation of the Mother. A bastard, in Shakespeare's day, is the acknowledged child of a nobleman by a woman other than his wife. So the father acknowledges the bastard. It is the mother who is negated, the mother who is lost. And it's a famous crux in Shakespeare, the absence in many of the plays of mothers. And we haven't talked about this now, but where is Mrs. Lear? What is that story? What was lost when she was lost, and how does that impact the way Lear seems to depend upon his daughters for an exaggerated expression of love and adoration? I'll come back to that in a little bit. We first learn of Edmund before we learn of anybody else in this play. It's a fascinating beginning. Kent and Gloucester on the stage at the start. Shakespeare's tragedies usually begin with minor figures, and then the great figures enter. And then Kent says, "Is not this your son, my lord?" And Gloucester responds, "His breeding, sir, hath been at my charge. I have so often blushed to acknowledge him that now I am brazed to it." And Kent, kind of speaking for the audience, says, "I cannot conceive you." Like, what do you mean? "Sir, this young fellow's mother could, whereupon she grew round-wombed, and had indeed, sir, a son for her cradle, ere she had a husband for her bed." This is a sort of version of Shakespearean locker room talk, I would say. "Do you smell a fault?" And Kent, looking at Edmund, says, "I cannot wish the fault undone, the issue of it being so proper." This guy looks great. "But I have a son, sir, by order of law, some year elder than this, who yet is no dearer in my account. Though this knave came something saucily to the world before he was sent for, yet was his mother fair, there was good sport at his making, and the whore's son must be acknowledged." All this in front of Edmund. I mean, how the hell is he supposed to react to his father talking this way about him and about his unacknowledged mother? And of course, we assume this is how he's been raised in this effect. Gloucester, on the one hand, says, I love him just as much as a legitimate son. On the other hand, he gives this sort of diatribe about his mother and about his making. And then he says, "Do you know this noble gentleman Edmund?" Edmund's first word, "No." No. Always important in a Shakespeare play, what are a character's first words? It tells us so much about that character. Hamlet's first words, "a little more than kin and less than kind." It's a pun, telling us that Hamlet is obsessed with the multiple meanings of words. What is Edmund's first word? "No, my lord." He is the walking spirit of negation in this play. And that's what is associated with his bastardy. I love the legal term, filius nullus, son of nothing. Wow, that's an amazing term for the idea of the bastard in this play, and it picks up with the nothingness theme. As Brian mentioned yesterday, Shakespeare loves the double plot. He loves having the two plots mirror each other in his plays. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, you have the high plot, as they often call it, of the aristocratic love. Theseus and Hippolyta, and their love is blocked at the opening of that play. That is then mirrored by the next level of class, as the younger lovers, Hermia and Lysander, Helena and Demetrius, also are in love, and their love is blocked. And by making them twins, Shakespeare gets to sort of double a plot that is already doubled. Then that plot gets mirrored in the fairy world, as Oberon and Titania, who are in a way the highest of the high in the play, also have their love blocked. Then you get to the lowest plot of the lowest class characters, bottom, the very bottom of the society, and the rude mechanicals, and they're putting on a play called Pyramus and Thisbe, which is a play about blocked love. And it's a version of what will become the Romeo and Juliet plot, which Shakespeare probably wrote within the same year of doing A Midsummer Night's Dream. Pyramus and Thisbe and Romeo and Juliet show the dangers of crossing the low plot and the high plot. And that is what Edmund puts into play in this play. He's going to cross those plots with catastrophic results. Another way to think about Lear is the father versus the child. That is another thing that Edmund brings to this play. We have Lear versus his daughters, Regan and Goneril. We have Gloucester versus Edmund, though he thinks it is Edgar. Just as Lear mistakes Cordelia, Gloucester mistakes Edgar. This is part of the great blindness motif, which runs all the way through the play, and the impossibility of seeing truly. So we need to ask ourselves, why is Shakespeare so drawn to these parallel plots, to this doubling, to this kind of multiplying of the same kind of plot in the play? What is this meant to show? Let's do one more clip from the same production. This is Raul Julia doing the part playing the part of Edmund.
Thou, nature, art my goddess. To thy law my services are bound. Wherefore should I stand in the plague of custom and permit the curiosity of nations to deprive me? For that I am some 12 or 14 moonshines, lag of a brother? Why bastard? Wherefore base? When my dimensions are as well compact, my mind as generous, and my shape as true as honest madam's issue? Why brand they us with baseness, bastardy, babes, who in the lusty stealth of nature take more composition and fierce quality than doth within a dull, stale, tired bed go to the creating a whole tribe of fops? Got to in a sleep and wake? Well then, legitimate Edgar, I must have your land. Our father's love is to the bastard Edmund as to the legitimate. Fine word, legitimate. Well, my legitimate, if this letter speed and my invention thrive, Edmund the base shall top the legitimate.
That's great. I always show that particular clip to my students. It's so important to get that sense of Edmund's character, the sexy, the charismatic, the erotic, the figure. He sort of is an example of the Mercutio principle. As long as Mercutio is on the stage, he's the only person you can look at. He's so fascinating, so compelling, so dynamic. And there's a legend that Shakespeare said, I had to kill Mercutio to keep him from killing the play. And so he whacks him off in the third act. Same sort of thing is happening with Edmund. I mean, everybody wants to marry him. Everybody wants him to be their son. Everybody is drawn to Edmund for a time. There's something that he represents that people want to somehow be a part of. I'll return to that in a bit. That speech he gives, legitimate, the law of nations versus the law of nature. Another classic assignment is to do a close reading of that play. Of that speech? What's really at work there? The law of nations says, honor thy father and mother, that thy days may be long upon the earth. All right? Respect the elder, respect the parent. According to Edmund, the law of nature says, kill your father and brother and seize their lands and wealth. But he does point out the curious absurdity of the law of nations, legitimate. I'd say the opposite of legitimate in this play is love. He's talking about what makes a child legitimate, and he mocks the law that makes this definition. What he really wants is to define that relationship as one of love. Where law and love are opposed, the law of nature can rise. Where law and love are joined together, we might think, an ideal society. In fact, we might think that's the great effort of the Old and New Testaments, to conjoin law and love. And we think about all the metaphors of rising and toppling and falling that we get. They are everywhere in this play. Edmund is the great twister of language. In the opening of Act 2, this is Act 2, Scene 1, this is when Gloucester sees him with the letter. And he says, what's that letter and what's going on? And he begins to tell him this whole plot. And Edmund, it's all a lie, of course. And he says to his father, when I dissuaded him, that is Edgar, from his intent, and found him pight to do it, with cursed speech I threatened to discover him. He replied, thou unpossessing bastard, dost thou think, if I would stand against thee, would the reposal of any trust, virtue, or worth in thee make thy words faithed? No. What I should deny, as this I would, though thou didst produce my very character, that is my handwriting, I'd turn it all to thy suggestion, plot, and damned practice. And thou must make a dullard of the world if they not thought the profits of my death were very pregnant and potential spurs to make thee seek it. Edmund is speaking the truth here, that it is a plot, that he made the whole thing up, that even though he's producing his brother's own handwriting, it's all a lie. But he's twisting it in such a way that he's putting it in the mouth of Edgar to make his father disbelieve the very words of his own son. This twisting of language, this corruption of language, that's a satanic element. That's what Milton's Lucifer does. That's what the whispering in the ear of Eve that we get in Paradise Lost is all about. Another great fool in Shakespeare, Feste in Twelfth Night, when Viola says, "Are you not the Lady Olivia's fool?" he says, "No, no, I'm not her fool. I am her corrupter of words." Now, the word corrupter in Shakespeare can either be very negative, the Edmund, the Iago, or very positive. Hamlet, too, is a corrupter of words, but in a way he's more the corrosive agent. He cleanses words to their essential meaning. Edmund tends to have stuff accrue to words, like a kind of sewage that makes for greater confusion. Now, this play makes a lot of arguments about nature. That's another great theme that runs all the way through the play. Lear says at one point, he's talking here to Regan, and he says, "Thou better knowest the offices of nature, bond of childhood, effects of courtesy, dues of gratitude." And Goneril threw me out, but you know the laws of nature. And Albany says something similar in Act 4 when he's talking about both Regan and Goneril. He says, "That nature which condemns its origin cannot be bordered certain in itself." So there's something unnatural in the ways the daughters have cast out the father. He later says, "Tigers, not daughters, is what you are." And then there's a great speech in the middle of Act 2. I won't do all of it. This always happens to me when I teach Shakespeare. I have to restrain myself because you just want to keep reading the language. Let me just pick up. Oh, let me skip a little bit of that. Yeah, I'll skip that. When he says to them, the great line, when they're saying, "Why do you need 100 knights? Why not 50? Why not 25? Why do you even need one?" And that great response, "Oh, reason not the need. Our basest beggars are in the poorest things superfluous. Allow not nature more than nature needs. Man's life is cheap as beasts." And it goes on a long speech about nature and the unnatural. And the play suggests that under that concept nature, there are two different meanings that we can trace. One is the basest idea of nature. Nature as mere appetite. The Hobbesian view of the law of nature. Solitary, nasty, brutish, short, all against all. The other meaning of nature is the higher part of what it means to be part of the creation. That nature ought to teach daughters to be faithful and to dote upon their fathers and to care for them. And the split between the two is the split in what it means to be human. We are in fact both of these, the nature of appetite and the nature of a higher calling. And that's one reason Shakespeare is so fascinated with doubling and with splitting, is to show this ambiguity within the human self. This is why he is so obsessed with the brother rivalry, which you can find in almost every Shakespearean play. And near the end of the play, when Goneril has poisoned Regan, Regan at one point says, "I'd rather give up the whole kingdom than have my sister get Edmund. I'd give up the whole thing just to keep, not because I love Edmund so much, but I don't want her to get him." This sororal rivalry that is so powerful in the play. It's not so much important that I get what I want, but just don't let her get what she wants. We see the same thing, of course, in Edmund versus Edgar. Put differently, this is really a simple play about family, as I'll say more about in a moment. And even Edmund's final words at the very end of the play, Act 5, Scene 3, near the end he says, "What you have charged me with, that have I done, and more, much more." And then they exchange forgiveness. And then he says, "The wheel has come full circle." And then we get a kind of moralizing from him. And then at the very end he says, "Yet Edmund was beloved, the one the other poisoned for my sake, and after slew herself." That's a pretty unsustainable definition of human love. Oh, I was loved. They both killed themselves in a meaningless way for me. That's where the concept of love in the play, we see it at its most debased, its most unnatural. That's where nature just as appetite will tend. So when he says, "Thou, nature, art my goddess," he is pledging his fidelity and even worship to that lowest part of what it means to be human. All right, let me talk more about this as a family drama. It's a famous theory of the family romance in which the child fantasizes that his real parents aren't actually his parents, that he's really descended from the aristocracy, that, oh, I'm really not the child of these folks, I'm the child of a prince and a princess in a faraway land. And we see this everywhere in mythology. In the myth of the foundling, Oedipus, it turns out, to his great surprise and horror, is actually the child of the king and the queen. It's too bad he married the queen. That makes for all kinds of complications. We see it in mythology everywhere. You see it in intriguing ways in the Bible. Christ, of course, is the best example. Not the son of a humble carpenter and his wife, but actually the son of the Most High. It's the most spectacular version of this family romance idea. Curiously, you don't get it in the figure of King David, who is such, he's a shepherd child from the start to the finish. It's only God's grace that makes him into a great king. And there's a really intriguing Davidic theme that runs all the way through Shakespeare's meditations on kingship. But if I follow that further, we'll be here all day. Let me see. The family romance. Okay, it is a disavowal of one's all too human parents. That's what underlies the family romance. I did not come from these mortal, imperfect, insufficient parents. I came from somewhere perfect. This is everywhere in this play. Regan and Goneril repudiate Lear as a father. Why do they do that? Why do they repudiate him so powerfully? It's an interesting observation that all the good people in this play love Lear. It's only the bad people who say, well, he's really losing it, he's not a good king, I never liked him all that much. Kent, Gloucester, Cordelia, one after another, the good people never really say that he was going bad. So why do they repudiate him? Anybody who's read the great novel by Jane Smiley called 1,000 Acres that retells the Lear story in a mid-century, 20th century American Iowa farm. Fascinating, beautiful book. But there it's revealed that the father figure, the Lear figure, sexually abused 2 of the daughters when they were young, after the mother had gone. Now, I don't want to push that reading literally in this play, but if you notice in all 3 versions of their performance last night of the Lear-Cordelia scene, and this is right there in the text, when does Lear finally freak out? Is when Cordelia says, "When I marry, I will honor my husband as much as my father." And that's when Lear seems to really lose his ability to stay rational in that moment. The idea of another man coming between him and his daughter, and his need for a total devotion from that daughter, that seems to be at the crux of this play. Edmund repudiates Gloucester as a father. He wants to substitute Cornwall in the place, a higher patronage. Cornwall at one point says, "You shall now be the son to me as your father." And then, of course, when Edmund has a shot at becoming himself king, marrying one daughter or the other, he wants to become himself the father figure. It's also a desire to see the father as he was when you were a child, when he was larger than life, truly heroic, almost godlike. And is that not the image of himself that Lear is trying to preserve? What he once was and is no longer. So behind the family romance motif is really an effort to repudiate mortality itself. To not acknowledge the aging, imperfect dotard of a father, but to somehow hold on to a father who never ages, who never dies. Also in the family romance is the competitive sibling. We get, of course, Regan and Goneril versus Cordelia, Edmund versus Edgar, Albany versus Cornwall. They become versions of the warring brothers. Eventually, of course, Regan versus Goneril. This sibling rivalry is everywhere in the play. The fool is the one, again, who articulates this so perfectly when he says fairly early on to Lear, "Ever since thou madest thy daughters thy mothers. For when thou gavest them the rod, and putst down thine own breeches," and then he goes on from there, "you made your daughters your mothers." You perverted or twisted the proper family dynamic. And I think that is happening in all sorts of ways in this play. Lear's paranoia about woman is profound in this play. In a much discussed speech in the middle of Act 4, he says of women, "Down from the waist they are centaurs, though women all above. But to the girdle do the gods inherit, beneath is all the fiends. There's hell, there's darkness, there is the sulphurous pit, burning, scalding, stench, consumption." It's a horrifying moment in the play when he defines woman as fiendish, as monstrous from the waist down. And Edgar says at one point about himself in Lear, "He childed as I fathered." In a way, Edgar is forced to become a father too soon in this play. What then do we make of Cordelia? To go back to that character who is, as Matt points out, is there at the start, and then everything happens, and then she comes back. Let me just show her in Act 4, Scene 3, when she reappears. She reappears first as somebody talked about. When a gentleman says, he's explaining to Kent how Cordelia responded when she heard the story about her father. He says, "Faith, once or twice she heaved the name of father pantingly forth, as if it pressed her heart, cried, 'Sisters, sisters, shame of ladies, sisters, Kent, father, sisters, what? In the storm, in the night, let pity not be believed.' There she shook the holy water from her heavenly eyes, and clamor mastered her. Then away she started to deal with grief alone." And there are other passages where we see that Cordelia gives the proper devotion that the child owes to the father, the proper respect to the aged, that reverence for the aged. I got a great piece here comparing this to Noah and his 3 sons in the book of Genesis, but it's going to take us far afield. So we'll skip that one. Oh, it's a good one. They say of Cordelia that she redeems nature. So that split in nature, appetite and higher calling, she redeems. She points us towards the second one. And then she gives her, in Act 4, Scene 7, her great speech of grace, where Lear begs her for forgiveness. And of course, if anybody ought to be forgiving Lear, it's Cordelia. And she asks him for his. It's a wonderful moment of not demanding vengeance, but instead offering grace. And if the play ended at the end of Act 4, we would have a lovely conclusion. As Matt suggested, we would have a marvelous conclusion, not unlike the conclusion of Shakespeare's last plays, his late romances. But instead we get the terrible Act 5, the awful, catastrophic conclusion of Act 5. And here, let me bring in the great theme of homelessness, which I think is so powerful in this play, and that gives this play such purchase on our own age. Matt talked about how Hamlet was the great play of the 19th century, and many have said that Lear is the play of the 20th century. And I think this idea of homelessness is very powerful in this respect. For what is it that happens to King Lear? At the start of the play, he is radically housed. Nobody is more housed than the king. He commands the world, controls the world. In effect, wherever he is, the kingship goes with him. He is completely sheltered, completely protected. Patriarch, lord, and master. Then he becomes, in the course of the play, radically unhoused. Most dramatically when he is tearing off his clothes in the middle of the heath with nothing else around him. And it's at that moment he gives what is one of my favorite speeches, not just in this play, but in all of Shakespeare. When they're going to go into the hovel, and he turns to the fool, nothingness itself, and says, "In, boy, go first." He lets the fool go into the shelter first. And then he says, "You houseless poverty. Nay, get thee in, I'll pray and then I'll sleep." And he kneels, "Poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness defend you from seasons such as these? Oh, I have taken too little care of this. Take physic, pomp. Expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou mayest shake the superflux to them and show the heavens more just." Remember I said earlier, Lear needs to be humbled. He needs to embrace the nothing if he is to be saved. This, I would say, is his salvific moment. I have taken too little care of this. How shall the homeless be housed? What a remarkable thing for an 80-year-old autocrat to make that kind of realization. How remarkable that is in a leader of any time. Then he sees poor Tom, and he realizes it's even worse than I had imagined. And that's the repeated dynamic of this play. As Edgar says, the worst is not as long as we can say this is the worst. It can always get worse. And actually, Edgar says 4 different times, "Oh boy, that was the worst. I'm glad I'm over that." And then bam, something else awful happens to him. That's the way this play works on us emotionally in the theater. And even if you've seen it 20 times, even if you've read it 40, taught it 100, you know exactly what's going to happen. When it's well performed, there's this emotional drop that happens every act of the play until at some point you say, "Enough. I cannot suffer along with these people any longer. This is too much to bear." And this, of course, is what happens in the astonishing conclusion. In Act 5, Scene 3, line 255, when Lear comes on stage bearing the body of Cordelia in his arms, and he says, "Howl, howl, howl, howl." Now, nobody had more command in the history of literature than Shakespeare. If you're going to repeat the same one-syllable word, it's going to come with such gravity, with such effect. The best version of this I ever saw was an old video of Anthony Hopkins playing Lear, and I can't find the video. But he comes on bearing Cordelia, and it's almost whispered. How, you think it'd be like, "Howl!" But it's not. It's just this muted, just this whispering. This almost, again, language itself fails. He says, "Oh, you are men of stones. Had I your tongues and eyes, I'd use them so that heaven's vault should crack." In Act 3, Scene 2, he tries to get language to match the storm. Now he sees a storm far more horrific, and he knows that language is utterly inadequate. And he says, "She's dead as earth." It compares her death to the death of the creation, to a wasteland itself. So is this the promised land or image of that horror? And then Lear interestingly says, when Kent tries to talk to him, "A plague upon you, murderers, traitors, all. All of you killed her. All of you are guilty." And that is a line that goes to the audience as well. If you're part of humanity, part of this stage of fools, you all contributed to her death. And then we get to the end. And my poor fool is hanged. No, no, no life. Notice there are 5 no's in these lines. Why should a dog, a horse, or rat have life, and thou no breath at all? O thou come no more. And then never, 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 never. What one scholar calls the most extraordinary blank verse line in English poetry. The never is the nothing now expanded to time and space. It negates not just Lear's moment, but all moments. It is truly apocalyptic language. There is nothing, and there never has been anything but the nothing. But then his last glimpse and his last words are to Cordelia. Pray you undo this button. Thank you, sir. Oh, 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 oh. And then, do you see this? Look on her, look. Her lips, look there, look there. It's a great question of this play. What is it that Lear sees? What is his final vision? Remember, his failure in Act 1 is that he did not look upon Cordelia truly. Kent says to him, see better, Lear, in Act 1, Scene 1. It's a failure of sight. And of course we get the great motif of sight and blinding in this play. See better. Now he is looking at Cordelia. He looks at her with an intensity. She is all the world to him. And we might think that that signifies a kind of, if not salvation, at least a turn towards salvation for Lear. In closing, let me note, Shakespeare's career does not end with King Lear. In his final 4 plays, the late romances, he seems to return to that horror and emptiness that he confronts in Lear, and he tries to imagine a different ending. In The Winter's Tale, the king Leontes has committed a terrible sin. He's caused the death of his wife and of his son, and he thinks of his daughter all at once. He then repents for 16 years, and at the play's end, he is granted a forgiveness that he neither earns nor deserves, but is nonetheless granted. That is the very essence of grace, that redeeming vision that we cannot find in Lear, but that Shakespeare expresses in his final plays. And as any reader of Shakespeare knows, his plays speak to each other. And we use one play to understand another. And so I'll close with words that I think are quite apt for a consideration of both law and family. Portia's words in the trial scene of The Merchant of Venice, which has a muted version of Lear's own sufferings, when she says, though justice be thy plea, consider this, that in the course of justice none of us should see salvation. We do pray for mercy, and that same prayer doth teach us all to render the deeds of mercy. Thank you very much. We have 5 minutes left for any questions or discussion or comments, anything at all about any of the talks today.
Could you share briefly what you said about the allusion to Noah and the 2 sons?
Oh, bless your heart. Yeah. Oh, I had to leave it out. Gosh, yeah, I'll slip you that 20 on the way out for asking. At the end of the Noah story, he has his 3 sons as Lear has his 3 daughters. And Noah, no longer heroic, no longer the figure who saves the world, he's now drunken and he falls asleep naked in his tent. And one son, Ham, sees his nakedness. The other 2 sons, Japheth and Shem and Japheth, they put the cloak on and walk backwards into the tent and drape it over their father. And it says they did not see his nakedness. They have a reverence for the father and they don't behold his weakness and his failing. I would say in this play we get an inversion of that. Cordelia either does not see or looks beyond her father's nakedness, that is his mortality, his failings. Whereas Regan and Goneril, I think, accentuate the nakedness and the failings. So it's I think Lear is often compared to Job in the Old Testament. I don't really see that. He's not a patient figure, or he has endurance certainly. But I think a Noah figure, those sort of totemic figures who rage against what it means to grow old and feeble. I think that's a better comparison with Lear. Yes, Rick.
You mentioned, thank you, that was great. You mentioned Jane Smiley in connection with repudiation. In an interview with the Washington Post, she retracted 1,000 Acres. So when she came to Washington later to give a book talk, I asked her, how do you retract a novel? And the answer, she quoted Shakespeare, just as he did. She said Shakespeare retracted the dark themes of his tragedies with the more optimistic view of his romances, so she thought she'd done nothing different than Shakespeare.
Well, fair enough. Yeah, retraction is a difficult term. Shakespeare certainly revised his earlier, but they're there. And 1,000 Acres, of course, is there. Yeah. And it's a powerful reading of this play. It's not the only reading of the play, obviously. But she gets at something that's very powerful there.
So Marc, is Cordelia speaking to Lear beyond this life? Do you think? Shakespeare making that suggestion?
To me, Cordelia gives she embodies and she expresses something above the representation of the rest of the play. Without Cordelia, we're really in the world of Edmund's unredeemed nature of appetite. And at best, we have some admirable moralizing figures, Kent being the most admirable, Albany, Edgar, very nice folks, and they'd be very helpful in a commonwealth. But they're not figures who are going to lead us to something greater than ourselves. Cordelia points to something beyond the merely human. And to that extent, I think she gives us something redemptive in all sorts of ways. It may or may not be metaphysically or spiritually redemptive, but it certainly redeems this stage of fools. It makes of it still a place of folly, but at least a place where there can be redemptive love between one fool and another. Yes?
Is there a source to the story, or did Shakespeare invent it?
Oh, he did not invent it. There are multiple versions of the Lear myth. There was a Celtic king, King Lear. There's a number of Irish myths of Lear. Lear's associated with the sea in Irish mythology. There are a number of play versions and chronicle versions that Shakespeare drew upon. The only original play Shakespeare really wrote was The Tempest, where he kind of came up with the plot himself. He was a great reviser of the work of others. Oh, yes?
Please talk more about the fool, because he was mentioned very infrequently.
Say more about the fool? Yeah, magnificent character. The whole, Shakespeare understood what he had in his second fool, Robert Armine. He writes him into Twelfth Night, he writes him into King Lear, and the idea of the fool as the speaker of wisdom, which is a trope that goes all the way through literature, that too is a Christ figure. Christ speaks essentially folly, and in that folly we see wisdom. And every fool figure in literature after is in some versions, in some sense, a version of that Christian wisdom in some ways. Real fools were supposed to entertain and satirize. So if you think about the Marx Brothers, if you think about kind of pure body satire, that was the kind of fool that most kings wanted to have hanging around. And then some kings wanted to have a fool who had it's called a more political edge to their satire, who were figures of real kind of wit and insight. It'd be sort of like having Jon Stewart or David Letterman hanging around the White House as an interesting guy to talk to. You don't want them to shape policy, but you wouldn't mind if they could sort of call out your own folly once in a while. So the fool is the figure of insight, not just of others, but of the king himself.
Do we see him sacrifice?
Say again?
Is he sacrificed?
He is a sacrifice. Yeah, he is one of several. Everybody is sacrificed to Lear's initial folly. That desire to give up and yet to keep, to have it both ways. That fundamental split in Lear himself. And so when he says, "My poor fool's hanged," it's pathos and sympathy for the fool, but I think it's also self-recrimination. Here's another innocent that I have killed. And it's when he's holding Cordelia's body in his own hands, of course. And some read Cordelia as the person he's referring to, my poor fool. Almost a sort of affection for Cordelia. And there's that long tradition that the same boy actor would play the fool as Cordelia because they're not on stage at the same time. Matt seemed to debunk that, but it's a long-standing, it's a fun theory to think about, that somebody would run on stage and speak her lines and then come on and speak the fool's lines. And in a way, both of them are trying to call Lear away from his worser self, but in kind of different registers and in different ways.
Thanks, Marc.
I think we're good. All right. Thanks, everybody.